Howdy, folks. I see 3 of you in here. Say hello. Okay, well, welcome to a read-through of Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. One viewer on both streaming platforms. Hopefully someone pops in. So the idea is to, I guess, just read through, offer thoughts, and hopefully people pop into the chat and get involved. So I switched up the format to display the text on the screen, I hope. Yeah, it is there. I don't know which chapter we're in. I just saw the word Augustus, though, so I'm assuming it's early Roman Empire at the from the shift from the Republic to the Empire system. Notwithstanding the seeming probability of both the conclusions, the latter of them at least is positively disowned by the language and conduct of Augustus. It is not easy to determine whether, on this occasion, he acted as a common father of the Roman world or as the oppressor of liberty. Whether he wished to relieve the provinces or to impoverish the Senate and the equestrian order, but no sooner had he assumed the reins of government than he frequently intimated the insufficiency of the tributes, the necessity of throwing an equitable proportion of the public burden upon Rome and Italy. In the prosecution of this unpopular design, he advanced, however, by cautious and well-weighted steps. Introduction of customs was followed by the establishment of excise, and the scheme of taxation was completed by an artful assessment on the real and personal property of the Roman citizens, who had been exempted from any kind of contribution above a century and a half. So it's like 100 and I forget how much a century's worth. Probably somewhere in the tens of thousands in modern comparison. In a great empire like that of Rome, a natural balance of money must have gradually established itself. It has been already observed that as the wealth of the provinces was attracted to the capital by the strong hand of conquest and power, so a considerable part of it was restored to the industrious provinces by the gentle influence of commerce and arts. Okay, so an initial exploitation, if you will, of the outer provinces once conquered, and then a gradual reintroduction of or establishment and development of industrious provinces. So maybe somewhat similar, analogous to modern times with the West's relationship with Asia, and increasingly Africa. South America probably doesn't fit into that. Okay. In the reign of Augustus and his successors, duties were imposed on every kind of merchandise, which through 1,000 channels flowed to the great center of opulence and luxury, and whatsoever manner the law was expressed, it was the Roman purchaser, not the provincial merchant, who paid the tax. Okay, so that sort of an export, it's kind of similar to today as well. Consumers get the burden of the brunt, so to speak, for enjoying the luxurious goods coming in a globalized fashion. The rate of the customs varied from the 8th to the 40th part of the value of the commodity. Okay. We have a right to suppose the variation was directed by the unalterable maxims of policy, that a higher duty was fixed on the articles of luxury than those of necessity, and that production raised or manufactured by the labor of the subjects of the empire were treated with more indulgence than was shown as pernicious, at least the unpopular, commerce of Arabia and India. Okay, so system in place to encourage necessities as opposed to luxuries, drives an efficient economy, I'm sure. There's still extant a long, good, and perfect catalog of Eastern commodities, which about the time of Alexander Severus were subject to the payment of duties: cinnamon, myrrh, pepper, ginger, and the whole tribe of aromatics, a great variety of precious stones, among which the diamond was the most remarkable for its price, and the emerald for its beauty. Parthian and Babylonian leather, cotton, silk, both raw, manufactured, ebony, ivory, and canucks. You may observe that though the use and value of these effeminate slaves gradually rose with the decline of the empire. Yep, that's one of the main theories. Yeah, I suppose the climate as well in that area of the world, mixed with things that have impulses upon the senses, triggering reactions. I could see how he would describe that. writing as we did in the 18th century, as effeminate slaves gradually rose with the decline of the empire. So as the center of power moves east with Constantine and the establishment of Christianity, so do the culture in the surrounding areas, just modern day Turkey, Syria, Iraq. All those things flow into the consciousness of the Romans. The excise introduced by Augustus after the Civil War was extremely moderate, but as general, it seldom exceeded 1%, but it comprehended whatever was sold in the markets by the public auction, from the most considerable purchases of lands and houses to those minute objects which can be derived value from the infinite multitude in daily consumption. Okay, food, rice. What do they call that in law? What was a French term for that? Never mind. Such a tax as it affects the body of the people has ever been the occasion of clamor and discontent. Emperor, well acquainted with wants and resources, is obliged to declare by a public edict the support of the army depended in great measure on the produce of the excise. Sure, so people are asking questions. Popular response is we need it for military campaigns, which garners morale across the people. Describing how money flows, though, basically, is what Gibbon's doing. When Augustus resolved to establish a permanent military force for the defense of his government against foreign and domestic enemies, he instituted a peculiar treasury for the pay of the soldiers, the reward of the veterans, and the extraordinary expenses of war. Yeah, I remember reading this in Robert Graves' I, Claudius. If a situation arose and certain garrisons, legions? Yeah, legions were having issues. Say they were across the Rhine up in German territory for months on end in the cold. Sometimes the emperor at the time would be forced to make emergency transfer funds. Extraordinary expenses of war. Yeah. But this is more like, say they're controlling modern day Serbia, Yugoslavia area, and Romania and Bulgaria, and was extracting money from them. He could refer back to the German campaigns, creating a sense of European unity, or at least awareness of each other of those two areas of Europe, northern Germany, and modern day Romania area. The ample revenue of the excise, though peculiarly appropriated to those uses, was found inadequate. To supply the deficiency, the emperor suggested a new tax of 5% on all legacies and inheritances. So inheritance tax, when you die, you want to give your money to your kids, most often. A big chunk of change goes to the government, even back then. The nobles of Rome were more tenacious of property than of freedom. Their indignant murmurs were received by Augustus with his usual temper. He candidly referred to the whole business to the Senate, exhorted them to provide for public service by some other expedient of a less odious nature. They were divided and perplexed. He insinuated to them that their obstinacy would oblige him to propose a general land tax and capitation. They acquiesced in silence. So, yeah, this was also portrayed in Robert Graves' I, Claudius. In that period, when you see democracy failing in sort of the last end days of the Republic, became sort of a pseudo-legislative session with a lot of the senators. So Augustus would suggest something coyly. The wiser of the senators would know that meant he didn't want it to happen, so they would vote against it. And if Augustus showed, if an emperor at the time showed that he was questioning something or didn't know about it, that meant really that he wanted it voted for. And so it became known, these little rules and patterns behind the scenes, end result being consolidation of power in one individual, Augustus. When the rights of nature and poverty were thus secured, it seemed reasonable that a stranger or a distant relation who acquired an unexpected accession of fortune should cheerfully resign a 20th part of it for the benefit of the state. Such a tax, plentiful as it may prove Every wealthy community was most happily suited to the situation of the Romans, who could frame their arbitrary wills according to the dictates of reason or caprice, without any restraint from the modern fetters and entails and settlements. From various causes, the partiality of paternal affection often lost its influence over the stern patriots of the Commonwealth and the dissolute nobles of the empire. If the father bequeathed to his son the fourth part of his estate, he removed all ground of legal complaint. But a rich, childish old man was a domestic tyrant, and his power increased with his years and infirmities. Yeah, so maybe describing a movement towards modern-day commerce where familial ties aren't necessarily, like, bequeathing isn't a right of the son. It's, an option of the bequeather or the father. With more globalization and economics, there's better things for his money to be going, i.e., the equivalent of corporate day, construction projects or whatever. So there's just common rule or line, cutoff line of, if the father has a complaining son, bequeaths 1/4 of his estate, by default, he removed the grounds for legal complaint. So I guess the burden of proof shifts on the son to say he's owed more. But a rich, childless old man was a domestic tyrant, and his power increased with his years and infirmities. A servile coward, in which he frequently reckoned praetors and consuls, courted his similes, pampered in avarice, applauded his follies, served his passions, and waited with impatience for his death. Oh, this is... Yeah, so what's great about Gibbon, what this book's sort of famous for, is his use of literary... approaches in his writing about history. It just makes it pleasant to read. A servile crowd, in which he frequently reckoned praetors and consuls, courted his similes, pampered his avarice, applauded his follies, served his passions, and waited with impatience for his death. The arts of attendance and flattery were formed into a most lucrative science. Those who professed it acquired a peculiar appellation, and the whole city, according to the lively descriptions of satire, was divided between two parties, the hunters and their game. So yeah, this is sort of in line with what I was describing going on in the Senate. Satire, witty, intelligent community, urbanized in a big way. Cosmopolitan type thinking. Yet, while so many unjust and extravagant wills were every day dictated by cunning and subscribed by folly, a few were the result of rational esteem and virtuous gratitude. Yeah, Cicero, who had so often defended the lives and fortunes of his fellow citizens, was rewarded with legacies to the amount of £170,000 in that day's currency, whatever that's worth today. Nor do the friends of the younger Pliny seem to have been less generous to that amiable order. So this is, I would view to being akin to lobbying today. Whatever was the modum of the testator, the treasury claimed without distinction the 20th part of his estate. In the course of 2 or 3 generations, the whole property of the subject must have gradually passed through the coffers of the state. Yeah, circulation. In the first and golden years of the reign of Nero, that prince, from a desire of popularity and perhaps from a blind impulse of benevolence, conceived a wish of abolishing the oppression of the customs and excise. The wise senators applauded his magnanimity, but they diverted him from the execution of a design which have dissolved the strength and resources of the republic. Yeah, so financial and political forces behind the scene of the head honcho, this case being the reign of Nero, actually wanting the government to have that firmer imprint on the states, developing areas of the northern Germany, Frankrica, or France. I'm sure it was Caesar who first went to the UK, but I don't think they established any sort of dominance over them for quite some time. So yeah, you've got the senators and the backroom dealers wanting that in place, which is vis-a-vis the head of state, or Nero, which is kind of counterintuitive to today's times, in that we usually see the executive wanting more money and more power, not wanting to give it away, and the legislature being the will of the regions, in the case of a Senate, and population and concerns to the parliament, them being the people who want to save the people money. Okay. Had it indeed been possible to realize the dream of such fancy, such princes as Trajan and the Antonines would surely have embraced with and or the glorious opportunity of conferring so signal an obligation on mankind. Satisfied, however, with alleviating the public burdens, they attempted not to remove it. The mildness and preciseness of the laws ascertained the rule and measure of taxation, and protected the subject of every rank against arbitrary interpretations, antiquated claims, and insolent vexations of the farmers of the revenue. For it's somewhat singular that in every age the best and wisest of the Roman governors persevered in this pernicious method of collecting the principal branches, at least of the excise and customs. Sentiments, indeed, the situation of Caracalla were very different from those of the Antonines. Inattentive, or rather averse to the welfare of his people, he found himself under the necessity of gratifying the insatiate avarice which he had excited in the army. The several impositions introduced by Augustus the 20th on inheritances and legacies was the most fruitful as well as the most comprehensive. As its influence was not confined to Rome or Italy, the produce continually increased with the gradual extension of the Roman city. New citizens, slow charged on equal terms with the payment of new taxes, which did not affect them as subject, derived an ample compensation from the rank they obtained, the privileges they acquired, and the fair prospects of honors and fortunes that were thrown upon their ambition. Okay, so nothing immediately benefit to the local Washingtonians of the time in Roman Italy. But this 1/20th inheritance tax was built upon amounts of people's being involved in the empire, because it was a consistent stream as long as you covered the families and the numbers, and I'm sure there was some sort of social services offered in return, I would hope. Construction of roads, for sure, would have been one. And involvement in the empire, and I guess protection. But yeah, it was easy money to gratify sort of the promotions that were keeping the Roman white-collar class happy. Legacies, inheritances, privileges they acquired, so esteem and prestige in the eyes of the community, which is becoming more important culturally, and the fair prospect of honors and fortune that was thrown upon their ambition. Yeah, you do a good job, you get this kind of payment. Favoritism. Nor was the rapacious son of Severus contented with such a measure of taxation as had appealed sufficient to his moderate predecessors. Instead of a 20th, he exacted a 10th of all legacies and inheritances, and during his reign, for the ancient proportion restored after his death, he crushed alike every part of the empire under the weight of his iron scepter. Okay, so turning a bit more authoritarian as opposed to commerce-oriented. When all the provincials became liable to the peculiar imposition of Roman citizens, they seemed to acquire a legal exemption from the tributes which they had paid in their former condition of subjects. Such were the maxims of the government adopted by Caracalla and his pretended son. This old as well as new taxes were at the same time levied in the provinces. It was reserved for the virtue of Alexander to retrieve them in a great measure from this intolerable grievance by reducing the tributes to the 13th part of the sum exacted at the time of the accession. It is impossible to conjecture the motives that enraged him to spare trifling a remnant of the public evil, but the noxious weed, which had not totally eradicated, again sprang up the most luxuriant growth, and in the succeeding age darkened the Roman roll with its deadly shade. In the course of this history, too, shall be summoned to explain the land tax, capitation, and the heavy contributions of corn, wine, oil, and meat which were extracted from the provinces for the use of the court, the army, and the capital. As long as Rome and Italy were respected as a center of government, their national spirit was preserved by the ancient and sensibly imbibed by the adopted citizens. The principal commands of the army were filled by men who had received a liberal education, who were well instructed in the advantages of laws and letters, and who had risen by equal steps through the regular succession of civilian and military honors. Their influence and example we may partly ascribe the modest obedience of the legions during the 2 first centuries of the imperial history. Yeah, exactly the point I was making earlier. And also with that, you've got the leaders of those communities perhaps visiting Rome, exchanging letters with power players in Rome via newly constructed roads, and so developing relationships, becoming integrated in some respects, in others kept at a distance, but perhaps in the same community. But when the last enclosure of the Roman constitution was trampled down by a carousel, the separation of the professions gradually succeeded to the distinction of ranks. The more polished citizens of the internal provinces were alone qualified to act as lawyers and magistrates. The rougher trade of arms was abandoned to the peasants, and barbarians of the frontiers knew no country but their camp, no science but that of war, no civil laws, and scarcely those of military discipline. Yeah. So yeah, the smarter of the leaders who could grapple with Latin law at the time, civil law, I'm sure were introduced to more organized systems and so allowed to become lawyers and magistrates, similar to today. But generally, the broader population knew no science but that of war because they're barbarians, no civil laws, and scarcely those military discipline. Yeah. With bloody hands, savage manners, desperate moves, and sometimes guarded, but much oftener subverted the throne or the emperors. Okay, so that wasn't enough to keep them happy, just being part of an empire that was growing and having defense. They can defend for themselves. What they're actually after is revolution or fit in somehow with the empire, be territory owners. In France, where the empire was pretty well established by this time. Or starting to be. There's flirtations with Germany north of the Rhine. It's a big, long-lasting military aim. Okay, Chapter 7. The Elevation and Tyranny of Maximun. Rebellion in Africa and Italy under the authority of the Senate. Civil wars and seditions. Violent deaths of Maximun and his son. Okay. I'll take a short break before I say this. Of the various forms of government which have prevailed in the world, an hereditary monarchy seems to present the fairest scope for ridicule. Is it possible to relate without an indignant smile that, on a father's decease, the property of a nation, like that of a drove of oxen, descends to its infant son, as yet unknown to mankind and to himself, and that bravest warriors and the widest statesmen, relinquishing their natural right to empire, approach the royal cradle with bended knees and protestations of inviolable fidelity? Satire and declamation may paint these obvious topics in the most dazzling colors, but our more serious thoughts will respect the useful prejudice that establishes a rule of succession independent of the passions of mankind. We should cheerfully acquiesce in any expedient which deprives the multitude of the dangerous, indeed the ideal power of giving themselves a master. Yeah, so something shameful in having warriors bow down to a succession system based on hereditary lineage. I agree. In the cool shade of retirement, we may easily devise imaginary forms of government, which the scepter shall be constantly bestowed on the most worthy by the free and incorrupt suffrages of the whole community. Yeah, and also the era that Gibbon is writing in, turned quite strongly to democracy, particularly in commerce. So there's been, in the cool shade of retirement, we easily devise imaginary forms of government, which the scepter shall be constantly bestowed on the most worthy by the free and incorrupt suffrages of the whole community. Yeah, so based on liberal education, I'm sure. Experience overturns these airy fabrics and teaches us that in larger society, the election of monarch can never dissolve to the wisest or the most numerous part of the people. The armies, so democracy never works out quite as planned in terms of meritocracy, but that's maybe not what it's actually aimed at doing. The army is the only order of men sufficiently united to concur in the same sentiments and powerful enough to impose them on the rest of their fellow citizens, but the temper of soldiers, habituated at once to violence and to slavery, renders them very unfit guardians of the legal, even the civil constitution. Agreed, at least in the long term.
Better call Saul.
Oh, I gotta follow. Finitude, thank you. Oh, cool, we got a chatter in the chat. I'll just pause. It's got a good question. When you perceive an object, do you perceive it directly or indirectly? To elaborate, I should say the following. In perceiving video recording, are you cognizing that thing as it appears to you, the phenomenon, or as it is in itself, the noumenon? Moreover, are you an object? If so, do you know yourself an appearance or a thing in itself? In other words, do you cognize your inner sense for what it isn't, or do you conceptualize yourself in terms of what you really are? Alright. Break those down. Yeah, I don't know. I think it presents to you like a video screen or an interaction as both a phenomenon, is it a thing as it appears to me, or as it is itself, noumenon. Yeah, a thing is a process, a surge of energy and connection of spirits that's happening. You got the technology itself actually transmitting all the data that needs to happen. In the physical world, you also potentially got a connection of spirits happening through some sort of other ether that you might believe in. Culturally, just language existing by itself in the ethos. You may be sharing that as well. Moreover, are you an object? Yeah. Yeah. I'll skip the second part. I'm in a more English rationalist mindset, like Edward Gibbon. This piece is Edward Gibbon in the midst of the Enlightenment. He wrote right dead center, I think, in the 1760s and 70s. So at the same time as like Voltaire and the Salons and Parisian type thinking. So he's giving a description of the Roman economic military systems. Also offering an analysis through the lens of his own age. Making firm, like settled arguments, but making decisions one way or another as to the goodness of what he sees. Which isn't uncommon for the day. Some say we have lost that art form today. Superior prerogative of birth, when it is obtaining the sanction of time and unpopular opinion, its plainest and least invidious of all distinctions among mankind. The acknowledged right extinguishes the hope of faction, and the conscious security disarms the cruelty of the monarch. The firm establishment of this idea we owe the peaceful succession and mild administration of European monarchies. To the fact it must attribute the frequent civil wars to which an Asiatic despot is obliged to cut his way to the throne of his fathers. Yet even in the East, the sphere of contention is usually limited to the princesses of the reigning houses, and as soon as a more fortunate competitor removed his brethren by the sword and the bowstring, he no longer entertained any jealousy of his meaner subjects. Yeah, so I guess a description of, in the era in which Gibbons is writing, how monarchs seem to be more of a dime a dozen the further east you go, Asiatic despots, compared to what's developing at that time is names and familiar names that the people can rest assured will be there in decades' time. With as you go through generations of kings and queens, and it's just self-evident that the firstborn son or secondborn daughter, whatever it is, most of the time a firstborn son, they're coming, and there's, if somebody attempts, like a brother, for example, to murder him, that will disallow him from the throne. It breeds a sense of ease amongst the masses, familiarity, extinguishes the hopes of faction, so that brings balance. You can focus on commerce, culture, civility. But the Roman Empire, after the authority of the Senate had sunk into contempt, was a vast scene of confusion. The royal and even noble families of the provinces had long since been led in triumph before the year of the haughty republicans. The ancient families of Rome had successfully fallen beneath the tyranny of the Caesars. And whilst those princes were shackled by the forms of a commonwealth and disappointed by the repeated failure of their posterity, it was possible that any idea of hereditary succession should have taken root in the minds of their subjects. The right to the throne, which none could claim from birth, everyone assumed from merit. Yeah, in their minds, until they become too accustomed with Augustus and his successors. They have that at the front of their mind, I think. And then in the next 100 years or so, the old habit of meritocracy, or at least the illusion of it, which the Roman Empire is still displaying, starts to fade. The daring hopes of ambition were set loose from the salutary restraints of law and prejudice, and the meanest of mankind might without folly entertain a hope of being raised by valor and fortune to a rank in the army, in which a single crime enable him to wrest the scepter of the world from his feeble and unpopular master. Okay, so you get guys climb up the ranks based on their merit. They see someone slip, and opportunities are available to them to work their way up. After the murder of Alexander Severus and the elevation of Maximun, no emperor could think himself safe upon the throne, and every barbarian peasant of the frontier might aspire to the august but dangerous station. So, he's not, he starts, this paragraph is interesting as a whole, because he starts out very flatteringly describing what the reader's going to know to be the current British system and continuity in terms of family members. Switches to the topic of Rome, talks about some of its drawbacks, what's going on the outer edges and within Rome itself, and then describes the system for working way up the ranks that are based purely on merit, sort of suggesting that was a good development of theirs, and maybe we could benefit from it. Every writer is almost is, especially when they're delving into political history, is keeping the current political climate in mind. And there's something going on here, whatever it is, in the paragraph with Gibbon. Just the way he's lining up the arguments, not non sequiturs, but what are you getting at by this paragraph? About 32 years before the event, the Emperor Severus, returning from an eastern expedition, halted in Thrace to celebrate with military games the birthday of his younger son Geta. The country flocked in crowds to behold their sovereign, and a young barbarian of a gigantic stature earnestly solicited in his rude dialect that he might be allowed to contend for the prize of wrestling. Cool. Yeah, wasn't Severus the guy big on gladiator games? And yeah, as the pride of discipline would have been disgraced by the overthrow of a Roman soldier by a Thracian peasant, he was matched with the stoutest followers of the camp, 16 of whom were successfully laid on the ground. This reminds me, this sounds like a modern day, who's that recent fight? Yeah, McGregor versus the Georgian. Having movies like Rocky IV as well, athletes, symbolic contests. In this respect, wrestling, just to sort of bring the two cultures together. Reminds me early 90s, Soviet Union collapse, New Russia, meeting of the minds of the West, or the U.S. and Soviet Union. That's what I think he's getting at here. His victory was rewarded by some trifling gifts and permission to enlist in the troops. The next day, the happy barbarian was distinguished above a crowd of recruits dancing and exulting after the fashion of his country. As soon as he perceived that he attracted the emperor's notice, he instantly ran up to the horse and followed him on foot without the least appearance of fatigue in a long and rapid career. "Thracian," said Severus with astonishment, "art thou disposed to wrestle after thy race?" "Most willingly," replied the unwearied youth, and almost in a breath, overthrew 7 of the strongest soldiers in the army. Gold collar was deprived of his match's vigor and activity. He was immediately appointed to serve in the horse guards, who always attended on the person of the sovereign. Yeah, so opportunism, make a good impression, and you can shoot up real fast, even if you're totally foreign. And I'm sure the new culture of the province sovereign had just conquered was new and interesting to him, and he pick and chose what he deemed to be the most interesting of the people there to come along with him, the horse guards. But how does that happen throughout the broader population? Probably not too often. Or yeah, in the military at least, as long as you're in the region, if you've got officers that integrating the armies, see it happening multiple levels there as well. Maximun, for that was his name, though born in the territories of the empire, is descended from a mixed race of barbarians. His father was a Goth, and his mother was a nation of the Tyranny. He displayed on every vacation of valor equal to his strength, and his native fierceness was soon tempered or disguised by the knowledge of the world. Under the reigns of Severus and his son, he obtained the rank of centurion, the favor and esteem of both of these princes, the former of whom was an excellent judge of merit. Gratitude forbade Maximun to serve under the assassin of Carcella. Honor taught him to decline the effeminate insult of Elagabalus. On the accession of Alexander, he returned to court and was placed by that prince in the station useful to service and honorable to himself. The 4th Legion, to whom he was appointed tribune, soon became under his care the best disciplined of the whole army. The general applause of the soldiers who bestowed on them the favorite hero of the names of Ajax and Hercules. He was successfully promoted to the first military command. And had not he still retained too much of his savage origin, the emperor might perhaps have given his own sister in marriage to the son of Maximun. Cool. Instead of securing his fidelity, these favors served only to inflame the ambitions of the Thracian peasant, who deemed his fortune inadequate to his merit, as long as he was constrained to acknowledge his superior. Though a stranger to real wisdoms, he was not devoid of selfish cunning, which showed him that the emperor had lost the affection of the army, and told him to improve their discontent to his own advantage. It is easy for factions in calumny to shed their poison on the administration of the best princes, and to accuse even their virtues by artfully confounding them with those vices to which they bear the nearest affinity. Troops listened with pleasure to the emissaries of Maximun. They blushed at their own ignominious patience, which during 13 years had supported the vexatious discipline imposed by an effeminate Syrian, the timid slave of his mother in the Senate. It was time, they cried, to cast away the useless phantom of the civil power, and to elect for the prince and a general and real soldier, educated in camps, excited in war, who assert the glory and distribute among his companions the treasures of the empire. A great army was at the time assembled on the banks of the Rhine under the command of the emperor himself, who, almost immediately after his return from the Persian War, had been obliged to march against the barbarians of Germany. Important care of training and reviewing the new levies was entrusted to Maximun. One day, as he entered the field of exercise, the troops, either from a sudden impulse or from conspiracy, saluted his emperor, silenced by their loud acclamations his obstinate refusal, and hastened to consummate their rebellion by the murder of Alexander Severus. Oh, so he's describing the death of Severus. Okay, so very sneaky, sly opportunism going on. Examples of Severus and other emperors at the time getting too close for comfort with a lot of the more wily foreigners and natives. The Goths, the Illyrians, did he say? So Goth is like modern day Romania, right? Led to his death, so you have to be careful. Great weaving in of a story of someone's life that would make a broader point, because I don't think the topic is necessarily Severus himself, but he kind of weaves his way into the narrative like that. The circumstances of his death are variously related. Writers who suppose that he died in ignorance or the ingratitude of the ambition of Maximun affirm that after taking a frugal repast of the sight of the army, he retired to sleep, and that about the 7th hour of the day a part of his guard broke into the imperial tent. With many wounds assassinated the virtuous and unsuspecting prince. Many stab wounds. If you credit another and indeed a more probable account, Maximun was invested with purple by numerous detachments, a distance several miles from the headquarters, and he trusted for success rather than secret wishes to the public declarations of the great army. Alexander had sufficient time to awaken a faint sense of loyalty among his troops, but their reluctant professions of fidelity quickly vanquished from the appearance of Maximun, who declared himself the friend and advocate of the military order and unanimously acknowledged emperor of the Romans by the applauding legions. Ooh, but how is that going to fly in Rome, Maximun? The son of Mamea, betrayed and deserted, withdrew into his tent, desirous at least to conceal his approaching fate from the insults of the multitude. He was soon followed by a tribune and some centurions, the minister's death. But instead of receiving with manly resolution the inevitable stroke, his unavailing cries and entreaties disgraced the last moments of his life. He converted into contempt some portion of the just pity which his innocence and misfortunes must inspire. His mother, Mamoa, whose pride and avarice he loudly accused as the cause of his ruin, perished with her son. The most faithful of his friends were sacrificed to the first fury of the soldiers. Others were reserved for the deliberate cruelty of the usurper. Those who experienced the mildest treatment were stripped by their employments, ignominiously driven by the court and the army. Yeah, I wonder how long this particular party lasted in terms of Severus' death. Was it 2 weeks? Was it a weekend? Months? Sounds like it was short-lived. And then you get the consequences. And the worst, probably public stabbing or whatever they did back there, was reserved for the more deliberate cruelty of the usurper. Former tyrants Caligula and Nero, Commodus, and Caracalla were all dissolute and unexperienced youths, educated in the purple and corrupted by the pride of empire, the luxury of Rome, and the perfidious voice of flattery. The cruelty of Maximun was derived from a different source, the fear of contempt. Though he depended on the attachment of his soldiers who loved him for virtues like their own, he was conscious that his mean and barbarian origin, his savage appearance, and his total ignorance of the arts and institutions of civil life formed a very unfavorable contrast to the amiable manners of the unhappy Alexander. He remembered that in his humble fortune he had often waited before the door of the haughty nobles of Rome, and had been denied admittance to the insolence of the slaves. He recollected, too, the friendship of the few had relived his poverty and assisted his rising hopes, but those who had spurned and those who had protected the Thracian were guilty of the same crime, the knowledge of his original obscurity. For this crime many were put to death, and by the execution of several of his benefactors, Maximin published his characters of blood, indelible history of baseness and ingratitude. Okay. So, sort of a Richard Nixonian figure. I remember him, certain unflattering biographies talking about him being from the Deep South and uncomfortable with the waspy Washington era. Maximin is perhaps a similar figure in that time, unlike Caligula, Nero, Commodus, and who are all educated in the purple. He had often waited at the doors of haughty nobles. Denied entrance by slaves. The dark and sanguinary soul of the time. I see that being equivalent to being denied, like not invited to the dinner parties in Washington or something, or drinks, or the dark and sanguinary soul of the tyrant was open to every suspicion against those among his subjects who were the most distinguished by their birth or merit. Whenever he was alarmed at the sound of treason, his cruelty was unbounded and unrelenting. A conspiracy against his life was either discovered or imagined. Magnus, consulate senator, was named as the principal author of it. Without a witness, without trial, without opportunity of defense, Magnus, with 4,000 of his supposed accomplices, was put to death. Italy and the whole empire was infested with innumerable spies and informers, and the slightest accusation, the first of the Roman nobles who governed provinces, commanded armies, and been adorned with consular and triumphal ornaments, chained on the public carriages and hurried away to the emperor's presence. Sounds like a horrible time. Confiscation, exile, or simple death were esteemed uncommon instances of his lenity. Some of the unfortunate sufferers he ordered to be sewed up in the hides of slaughtered animals, others to be exposed to wild beasts, others again to be beaten to death with clubs. During the 3 years of his reign, he disdained to visit either Rome or Italy. His camp occasionally removed from the banks of the Rhine to boost to those of the Danube was the seat of his stern despotism, which trampled on every principle of law and justice, and was supported by the avowed power of the sword. No man of noble birth, elegant accomplishments, or knowledge of civil business who suffered near his person. The court of the Roman Empire revived the idea of those ancient chiefs of slaves and gladiators whose savage powers had left you from pressure of terror and devastation. Cool. If I read this today, it would be like, where's your evidence? Where's your evidence? But he's writing in particular form. Not everything has to be cited. Very strong opinions. I get the picture. Just a madman running wild government. As long as the cruelty of Maximin was confined to the illustrious senators, even to the bold adventurers from a court of army exposed themselves to the caprices of fortune, the body of the people viewed their sufferings with indifference, perhaps with pleasure. So jeering, I see, and it being sort of behavior that's spread further beyond Maximin just by negative role models, so to speak. Keep in mind, he's describing whole generations all at once, and people's minds change and develop, and it's tough to describe like evolution of their thinking in such concise terms as he does it in these paragraphs. You leave a small paragraph like the one above with like a mental picture of a whole period. So people have either been they're wise enough to be quiet in this reign, Maximun's reign, or the jeering, perhaps with pleasure. Tyrants average stimulated by the insolent, insatiate desires of the soldiers at length attacked the public property. Every city of the empire was possessed of an independent revenue, destined to purchase corn for the multitude and supply the expenses of the games and entertainments. By a single act of authority, the whole mass of wealth was at once confiscated for the use of the imperial treasury. Temples were stripped of the most valuable gold. Offerings of gold, silver, and statues of gods, heroes, emperors were melted down and coined into money. Those impious orders could not be executed without tumults and massacres. As in many places, the people rather chose to die. The deference of their altars to behold in the midst of peace their cities exposed to the rapine and cruelty of war. Sort of reminds me of a Mad Max gouging of resources for the purposes of fanfare. In Mad Max, the newest one, it's when they pour the water down and there's fires and guitars and games. And Maximum's time, I believe Nero's time, I don't know, one of them, or Severus, gladiator games, huge event, like mass migration is just to get there for the raunchness. Schmelting down gold into money. An exciting snapshot at a time, obviously seen through the lens of, oh dear, what happened, but what good came of that? Probably congregating of citizens in a way that created like this cosmopolitan type cultures. I think that like entertainment, big events like that add to that currency in an empire, even if it's stripping the provinces bare. In the meantime, it creates this social setting that hadn't been seen a lot too much before, or it had, but in different levels. Obviously nasty one based on violence and sport and game and interesting time in history. I'm getting to think of playoffs in my city, the last one being 2004, like that. That was something else. Procurator of Africa was a servant worthy of such a master, who considered the fines and confiscation of the rich as one of the most fruitful branches of the imperial revenue. An iniquitous sentence had been pronounced against some opulent youths of that country, the execution of which would have stripped them of far greater the price of their patrimony. In this extremity, a resolution that must either complete or prevent their ruin was dictated by despair. A respite of 3 days, obtained with difficulty from the precious treasurer, was employed in collecting from their estates a great number of slaves and peasants blindly devoted to the commands of their lords and armed with their rustic weapons of clubs and axes. The leaders of the conspiracy, as they were admitted to the audience of the procurator, stabbed him with the daggers concealed under their garments, and by the assistance of their tumultuary train, seized on the little town of Thisdris and erected the standard of rebellion against the sovereign of the Roman Empire. Flag, standard of rebellion. Rested their hopes on the hatred of mankind against Maximun, and they judiciously resolved to oppose to that destined tyrant and emperor whose mild virtues had already acquired the love and esteem of the Romans, whose authority over the province would give weight and stability to the enterprise. Gordianus, their proconsul, and the object of their choice, refused with unfeigned reluctance the dangerous honor, and begged with tears that they would suffer him to terminate in peace a long and innocent life without straining Staining his feeble age with civil blood, their menace compelled him to accept imperial purple as only refuge, indeed, against the jealous cruelty of Maximun. Since, according to the reasoning of tyrants, those who had ever been esteemed worthy of the throne deserve death, and those who deliberate have already rebelled. The family of Gordianus was the most illustrious of the Roman Senate, and on the father's side was descended from the Gracchi, and his mother's from the Emperor Trajan. Great estate enabled him to support the dignity of his birth, and in the enjoyment of it he displaced an elegant taste and beneficent disposition. The palace in Rome, formerly inhabited by the great Pompey, had been during several generations in the possession of the Gordian family. It was distinguished by ancient trophies of naval victories and decorated with the works of modern painting. His villa on the road to Praenest was celebrated for baths and singular beauty and extent, for 3 stately rooms 100 feet in length, and for a magnificent portico supported by 200 columns of the 4th most curious and costly sorts of marble. Public shows exhibited at his expense, and in which people were entertained with many hundreds of wild beasts and gladiators, seemed to surpass the fortune of the subject, and whilst the liberality of other magistrates was confined to a few solemn festivals in Rome, the magnificence of Gordian was repeated when he was ate up every month in the year, and extended during his consulship to the principal cities of Italy. He was twice elevated to the last mentioned dignity Caracallas and by Alexander, and he possessed the uncommon talent of acquiring the esteem of virtuous princes without alarming the jealousy of tyrants. His long life was innocently spent in the study of letters and the peaceful honors of Rome, until he was named proconsul of Africa by the voice of the Senate and the approbation of Alexander. He appeared prudently to have declined the command of armies and the government of the provinces. As long as that emperor lived, Africa was happy, and under the administration of his worthy representative. After the barbarous Maximun had usurped the throne, Gordianus alleviated the miseries which he was unable to prevent. When he reluctantly accepted purple, he was above 80 years old, the last and valuable remains of the happy age of the Antonines, whose virtues he revived in his own conduct and celebrated in an elegant poem of 30 books. The venerable proconsul's son, who had accompanied him in Africa as his lieutenant, was likewise declared emperor. His manners were less pure, but his character was equally amiable with that of his father. 22 acknowledged concubines in a library of 62,000 volumes attested the variety of his inclinations, and from the productions which he left behind him, it appears that the former as well as the latter were designed for use rather than for ostentation. The Roman people acknowledged in the features of the younger Gordian the resemblance of Scipio Africanus, recollected with pleasure that his mother was the granddaughter of Antonius Pius, and rested the public hope on those Latin virtues which had hitherto, as they fondly imagined, lain concealed in the luxurious indolence of private life. So you've got a subtle transition back to Africanus. 30 books, that's cool. So someone with more of an appreciation for intellectual stuff. Gordianus. He did come to power savagely, though. Stabbing. But at the same time carrying on gladiator stuff. Okay. As soon as the Gordians had appeased the first tumult of a popular election, they removed their court to Carthage. They were received with the acclamations of the Africans who honored their virtues and who, since the visit of Hadrian, had never beheld the mastery of the Roman Empire. But these vain acclamations neither strengthened nor confirmed the title of Gordians. They were induced by principle as well as an interest to solicit the approbation of the Senate, and deputation of the noblest provincials was sent without delay to Rome to relate and justify the conduct of their countrymen, who, having long suffered with patience, were at length resolved to act with vigor. So another rapprochement, this time in Africa, for the second time, it sounds like. the second big time since Hadrian. Like, prior to this, how often did the Roman Republic do that? Probably not too many times. I don't know. So you get the North Mediterranean really shifting Roman. I guess before that, what do you got? The Egyptians way back, Greeks had settlements as well. The letters of the new princes were modest and respectful, accusing the necessity which had obliged them to accept the imperial title, but submitting their election and their fate to the extreme judgment of the Senate. The inclinations of the Senate were neither doubtful nor divided. The birth and noble alliance of the Gordians had intimately connected them with the most illustrious houses of Rome. Their fortune had created many dependents in that assembly. Their merit had acquired many friends. Their mild administration opened the flattering prospect of the restoration not only of the civil but of the republican government. Terror of military violence would have first obliged the Senate to forget the murder of Alexander and ratify the election of barbarian peasant, now produced a contrary effect and provoked them to assert the injured rights of freedom and humanity. The hatred of Maximun towards the Senate was declared implacable. Tame's submission had not appeased his fury. The most cautious innocents would not remove his suspicions, and even the care of their own safety urged them to share their fortune of enterprise, of which, if unsuccessful, they are sure to be the first victims. So this is just a description of what living with Maximun was like. These considerations, and perhaps others of a more private nature, were debated in the previous conference of the consuls and the magistrates. As soon as the resolution was decided, they convoked to the temple of Castor the whole body of the Senate, according to an ancient form of secrecy, calculated to awaken their attention and conceal their decrees. Conscript fathers, said the consul Silanus, 2 Gordians, both of consular dignity, the one year proconsul and the other year lieutenant, have been declared emperors by the general consent of Africa. Let us return thanks. He boldly continued to the youth of Thistris. Let us return thanks to the faithful people of Carthage, our generous deliverers from a horrible monster. Do you hear me thus coolly, thus timidly? Do you cast those anxious looks at each other? Why hesitate? Maximun is a public enemy. May his enmity soon expire with him, and may we long enjoy the prudence and felicity of Gordian the father, the valor, the constancy of Gordian the son. Noble ardor of the consul revived the languid spirit of the Senate. By unanimous decree, the election of the Gordians was ratified. Maximun and his son, his adherents, were pronounced enemies of the country, and liberal rewards were offered to whoever had courage and good fortune to destroy them. The Senate in Rome or the Senate in North Africa? Anyway, very public uprising, a coup. Shaped a lot by North African culture. Like, if this succeeds, it could be huge in terms of allowing a lot of the culture and customs from that area of the empire to shape future governance. During the emperor's absence, a detachment of the Praetorian guards remained at Rome to protect or rather command the capital. The Praetorian is like modern day, not Secret Service, but a little bit larger, like Germany's SS, I suppose. Really elite military guys, I think. Can't remember. The Prefect Battalionists had signaled his fidelity to Maximun by the alacrity with which he had obeyed and even prevented the cruel mandates of the tyrant. His death alone could rescue the authority of the Senate and the lives of the senators from a state of dangers and suspense. Before their resolves had transpired, a quaestor and some tribunes were commissioned to take his devoted life. They executed the order with equal boldness and success, and with their bloody daggers in their hands ran through the streets proclaiming to the people and the soldiers the news of the happy revolution. The enthusiasm of liberty was seconded by the promises of a large donative and lands and money. The statues of Maximun were thrown down. The capital of the empire acknowledged would transport the authority of the 2 Gordians in the Senate. The examples of Rome was followed by the rest of it. Yeah, so as soon as it hits the streets of Rome, then it becomes pretty dangerous. It's less just whisperings in a city across a big sea, and it's really hit home. And that's when action occurs. And you get the early Stalin type stuff where he makes sure to take control of the city and the municipal controls, and that's how he sneaks into national power. Statues of Maximun were thrown down. As soon as that stuff starts happening, you look at departments like the police force and what they're doing. The utilities, whoever had the sewer ducts, or treasury, or the arms. People running in the streets slowly taking over those buildings. Is this a description of the overthrow? How does it end? A new spirit had arisen in that assembly whose long patience had been insulted by wanton despotism and military license. The Senate assumed the reins of government with a claim of intrepidity, prepared to vindicate by arms the cause of freedom. Among the consular senators recommended by their merit and service to the favor of the Emperor Alexander, it was easy to select 20 not unequal to the command of an army and the conduct of a war. To these was the defense of Italy entrusted. Each was appointed to act in his respective department, authorized to enroll and discipline the Italian youth, and instructed to fortify the ports and highways against the impending invasion of Maximin. A number of deputies chosen from the most illustrious of the senatorian and equestrian orders were dispatched at the same time to the governors of the several provinces, earnestly conjuring them to fly to the assistance of the country and remind the nations of their ancient ties of friendships with the Roman Senate and people. So the senators step in, see what's happening. No, they have to take control. I guess it turns into a pseudo-oligarchy, but more like an inaction plan to consolidate the cities, control the cities with respect to what's the example he uses? Departments, discipline the Italian youth, so education, that's pretty important. Fortify ports and highway gates. Okay. These days it would be like electricity, internet, telecommunication towers. Anyway, they broaden that to start reaching into the provinces and establishing connections there, because that support will be sorely needed. And they attest to their sense of loyalty to the Senate as opposed to the Emperor. See how successful they are. For a while, the cause of the Gordians was embraced with such diffusive ardor, the Gordians themselves were no more. The feeble court of Carthage was alarmed by the rapid approach of Capellanius, governor of Mauritania, who, with a small hand of veterans and a fierce host of barbarians, attacked a faithful but unwarlike province. The younger Gordians sallied out to meet the enemy at the head of a few guards and a numerous undisciplined multitude educated in the peaceful luxury of Carthage. His useless valor served only to procure him an honorable death on the field of battle. His aged father, whose reign had not exceeded 30, opened her gates to the conqueror, and after was exposed to the rapacious cruelty of a slave, obliged to satisfy his unrelenting master with a large account of blood and treasures. So, what could have been? What could have been? High hopes, Gordian. But everybody in Rome has already revolted. So who's gonna step in here and take the reins, or is it gonna be quashed? What does this remind me of? I don't know. Maybe 1945 nationalists, the Chinese government basically fighting off the Japanese, and then dying out in the process. This is on a macro scale, not individual scale. And then the Maoists swooping in at the end, even though they were a fringe party before. I don't know. That's not a good analogy, but it's just brought that up. Yeah, the fate of the Gordians filled Rome with just Just by unexpected terror, the senators convoked in the Temple of Concord effected to transact common business of the day and seemed to discipline with trembling anxiety the consideration of their own and the public danger. A silent consternation prevailed in the assembly till a senator of the name and family of Trajan awakened his brethren from their fatal lethargy. He represented to them that the choice of cautious dilatory measures had been long since been out of power, that Maximun, implacable by nature and exasperated by injuries, was advancing towards Italy, the head of the military force of the empire. Their only remaining alternative was either to meet him bravely in the field or tamely to expect the tortures of the ignominious death reserved for unsuccessful rebellion. We have lost, continued he, 2 excellent princes, but unless we desert ourselves, the hopes of the republic have not perished with the Gordians. Many are the senators whose virtues have deserved and whose abilities would sustain the imperial dignity. Let us select 2 emperors, one of whom may conduct the war against the public enemy, while his colleague remains at Rome to direct the civil administration. I cheerfully expose myself to the danger and envy of the nomination, give my vote in favor of Maximus and Balbinus. Ratifying my choice, contrary fathers will appoint in their place others more worthy of their empire. The general apprehension silenced the whispers of jealousy. The merit of the candidates were universally acknowledged, and the house was out with sincere exclamation, long life and victory the emperors Maximus and Balbinus. And you're happy in the judgment of the Senate. May the republic be happy under your administration. Cool, so envisioning a new senatorial system. Is this how Augustus and then Caesar, sort of like the modern day president, prime minister in France kind of thing, or chancellor, prime minister in Germany worked? What is the motive, though, the Senate convoked of the person who wanted to arrange this and not choose himself in power? Till a senator of the name and family of Trajan awakened his brethren from their fatal lethargy. So he says, okay, it's shitty in the empire right now. Everyone knows it. People hate Maximun. We need to change. Here's what's coming at us. What are we going to do? We've lost. We got to unite. 2 emperors. Maybe he's in touch with the political system at the time. Well, obviously he's in there, but do it for the good of the empire. Virtues and the reputation of the emperors justified the most sanguine hopes of the Romans. The various nature of their talents seemed to appropriate to each his peculiar department of peace and war without leaving room for jealous emulation. Balbinus was an admired orator, poet of distinguished fame, and a wise magistrate. He exercised with innocence and applause civil jurisdiction in almost all the interior provinces of the empire. His birth was noble, his fortune affluent, his manners liberal and affable. In home, the love of pleasure was corrected by a sense of dignity, nor had the habits of ease deprived him of capacity for business. The mind of Maximus was formal and a rougher mold, but his valor and abilities he had himself from the meanest origin to the first employments of the state and army. His victories over the Sarmatians and the Germans, the austerity of his life, and the rigid impartiality of his justice when he was a prefect of the city, commanded the esteem of people whose affections were engaged in favor of the more amiable Balbinus. 2 colleagues had both been consuls. Balbinus had twice enjoyed that honorable office. He had been named among the 20 lieutenants of the Senate, and since one was 60, the other was 74 years old, they both attained the full majority of age and experience. Awesome. So just because the executives run amok doesn't mean everybody's lost their sense of community and principles. And you got somewhat distinguishing features between the 2 emperors, which makes for a successful ballot in any time. Rougher mold. After the Senate had conferred on Maximus and Balbinus an equal portion of the consular and tribunician powers, the title of fathers in their country, and the joint office of Supreme Pontiff, they ascended to the capital to return thanks to the God, protectors of Rome. Joint Office of Supreme Pontiff. Yeah, I haven't really touched on religion right now, the factor it played, but I think, yeah, it's certainly important. The solemn rites of sacrifice were disturbed by a sedition of the people. Their licentious multitude neither loved the rigid Maximus, nor did they sufficiently fear the mild and humane Balbinus. Increasing numbers surrounded the temple of Jupiter, whose obstinate clamor they asserted their inherent right of consenting to the election of their sovereign, demanded with apparent moderation that besides the 2 emperors chosen by the Senate, a third should be added, the family of the Gordians, as a just return of gratitude to those princes who had sacrificed their lives for the Republic. The head of the city guard and the youth of the questioning order, Maximus and Balbinus, attempted to cut their way through the seditious multitude. The multitude, armed with sticks and stones, drove them back to the capital. It's prudent to yield when they contest, whatever they may be issue of it, must be fatal to both parties. When they contest, whichever may be the issue, must be fatal. Boy, only 13 years of age, grandson of the elder and nephew of the younger Gordian, was produced to the people invested in ornaments, title of Caesar. Tumult was appeared by the easy condescension, and the two emperors, as soon as they had been peacefully acknowledged in Rome, prepared to defy Italy against a common enemy. Okay, I'm gonna cut it there. Where am I? Page 178? No, 176, I think. 176. Maybe pick up there next time. Anyway, thanks for watching, you guys. Thanks, Finitude, for your comment earlier. I'm sorry, it was like Heideggerian stuff. My mind's not really on that right now, but maybe I'll come back to that and make a video response or something. Anyway, have a great night.